"Get rid of her. She is a mistake," said the billionaire CEO. 5 years later, he saw her with 3 beautiful children and realized he had destroyed the only real thing he ever had. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to another story where hearts break, rebuild, and learn what real strength looks like. May every woman reading this be wrapped in courage that fear cannot touch, wisdom that doubt cannot shake, and love that betrayal cannot kill. May your scars tell stories of survival, not surrender. May your tears water the seeds of your next season. You are the proof that endings are just beginnings in disguise, that walking away is sometimes the bravest step forward, and that a mother's love can heal wounds the world said were permanent. You are sunrise after the longest night, the answered prayer, the unbreakable spirit. This is mission 1,000 likes for every woman who walked away from a man who could not see her worth, who built a life from broken pieces, who still believes love should feel like safety. If your heart knows this pain, like this video. If your soul has survived this fire, comment, "I stand with Sandra," to my channel and let me know where you're watching from. The check slid across Carl Benson's mahogany desk like a knife, 6 zeros glinting under the cold office lights. Hush money dressed up as generosity, erasure disguised as a solution. Sandra Nelson stared at it, her hands folded in her lap to stop them from shaking, her heartbeat so loud she was certain he could hear it. The executive suite felt cavernous now, all floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist furniture, every surface designed to intimidate, to remind visitors they were small and he was untouchable. She had practiced this conversation for a week, rehearsing the words in her bathroom mirror at 3 a.m., imagining his face softening when she told him, maybe reaching for her hand, maybe even crying. Instead, Carl stood behind his desk like a judge delivering a verdict, his expression carved from marble, his eyes fixed on some point past her shoulder as though looking at her directly might make this real. "This takes care of everything," he said, his voice flat, businesslike, the same tone he used in boardroom meetings when closing deals that meant nothing to him. Transition into backstory. But nothing about Sandra Nelson was supposed to be taken care of. She was not a line item to be reconciled, not a problem to be solved with money and silence. 3 months ago, she had been the woman who made him laugh in elevators, who stayed late at the office not because she had to, but because being near him felt like standing in sunlight. 3 months ago, she had believed the quiet promises he whispered when no one else could hear, believed that beneath the billion-dollar empire was a man capable of choosing love over legacy. She had been wrong. Sandra lifted her eyes from the check to the man standing across from her, and for the first time since entering his office, she saw him clearly. Not the man she loved, not the man she hoped he could become, but the man he had always been, ruthless, calculating, incapable of seeing her as anything more than a complication threatening his carefully constructed world. Her hand moved, not to take the check, but to stand. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than she intended, but steadier than she expected. "I don't want your money, Carl." The silence that followed would haunt both of them for years, but for very different reasons. For Carl, it was the moment he lost control. For Sandra, it was the moment she found herself. She walked out of Carl Benson's office that afternoon and disappeared from his world entirely. No forwarding address, no final confrontation, no social media trail for him to follow. She simply evaporated from the life he had built, taking with her the only thing he would ever truly lose, the chance to know what real love felt like. 5 years would pass before Carl Benson saw Sandra Nelson again. 5 years before he understood that some mistakes cannot be corrected with apologies or amended with wealth. 5 years before he learned that the woman he called a mistake would become the only truth he ever told. But first, Sandra had to survive. Sandra Nelson left the city on a Tuesday morning, the kind of ordinary day that should not have held the weight of an entire life unraveling. She packed what fit into 2 suitcases and a backpack, left her apartment key on the kitchen counter, and boarded a bus heading south before the sun fully rose. No farewell texts, no final Instagram post with cryptic captions about new beginnings, no forwarding address left with the landlord. She simply ceased to exist in the world Carl Benson inhabited, erasing herself as thoroughly as he had tried to erase her. The bus smelled like artificial lemon and old upholstery, and Sandra pressed her forehead against the cold window, watching the city skyline shrink in the distance. Somewhere in that glittering landscape of steel and ambition, Carl was probably already at his desk, reviewing contracts, approving mergers, living as though she had never existed at all. The thought did not make her angry anymore. It made her hollow. She arrived in a small coastal town 3 hours away, the kind of place where people still said good morning to strangers and the air tasted like salt and second chances. Her Aunt Marion met her at the bus station, asking no questions, just pulling Sandra into a hug that smelled like lavender and old books. The guest room above Marion's bookstore became Sandra's sanctuary, a space so small she could touch both walls with her arms outstretched, but it was hers. Safe. Invisible. The first month was the hardest. Morning sickness that lasted all day, exhaustion that felt like drowning, and a loneliness so profound it had texture and weight. Sandra would lie awake at 3 a.m., one hand on her still flat stomach, wondering if she had made a catastrophic mistake. Not about keeping the baby, that decision was carved into her bones, but about walking away from the security Carl's money could have provided. 6 zeros could have meant a comfortable apartment, quality prenatal care, a future without the constant terror of not having enough. But it also would have meant belonging to him, being owned by her own survival. Marion brought her herbal tea and second-hand maternity clothes without making Sandra feel like charity. The women at the local community center offered gentle friendship, the kind that did not require explanations or backstory. They taught her how to apply for state assistance without shame, how to navigate the healthcare system when you have more courage than resources, how to knit tiny socks while sitting in waiting rooms. They did not ask about the father. They did not need to. At night, alone in her small room with the sound of the ocean bleeding through the walls, Sandra mourned. But she was not mourning Carl Benson, the man. She was mourning the fiction she had built around him, the version of him that existed only in her hopeful imagination. The man who whispered promises in dark offices had never been real. The man who slid a check across a desk and called her a mistake, that was the truth. That was who he had always been. She deleted his number from her phone, not in anger but in necessity, blocked his email, removed every photograph, every text message, every digital trace of the 3 months she had loved a ghost. Some nights she wanted to call him, wanted to scream or beg or demand he acknowledge what he had done. Other nights she wanted to disappear so completely that even she forgot she had ever existed in his world. Instead, she chose a third option. She rebuilt. Sandra got a job at Marion's bookstore, shelving books and helping customers, work that was simple and honest and hers. She attended every prenatal appointment, even the ones where she sat alone in waiting rooms surrounded by couples holding hands. She learned to cook cheap, nutritious meals. She walked along the beach every evening, talking to the child growing inside her, making promises she intended to keep. The temptation to file for child support visited her more than once. It would have been legal, justified, easy. But Sandra understood that every dollar from Carl would come with invisible chains. He would use money as access, as leverage, as proof that she needed him. Financial security was not worth surrendering the freedom she had fought so hard to claim. 8 months after leaving the city, Sandra stood in front of the mirror in her small bathroom, her hands resting on a belly that had grown impossibly large. Her reflection showed a woman she was still learning to recognize, thinner in some places, fuller in others, eyes that held exhaustion and determination in equal measure. The doctor had confirmed it weeks ago: triplets, 3 heartbeats, 3 futures, 3 reasons to keep standing. "I will be enough," she whispered to her reflection, to the children inside her, to the universe that was listening. The woman who left Carl Benson's office had been afraid she would break. The woman standing here now understood that breaking and rebuilding were the same sacred process. The triplets arrived on a Thursday in March, 3 weeks early and impossibly perfect. Maya came first, screaming her arrival with fierce lungs and clenched fists. Then Caleb, quieter but watchful, his dark eyes already studying the world. Finally Zara, the smallest, who entered the world so silently the doctors rushed her to the warming table before Sandra heard the cry that confirmed her daughter was breathing, fighting, alive. Sandra held them for the first time in the recovery room, one baby cradled in each arm while a nurse supported the third against her chest, and understood with sudden clarity that she had never been whole until this moment. These 3 tiny humans, with their perfect fingers and impossible fragility, were not the consequence of her mistake with Carl Benson. They were the reason everything else had happened exactly as it should. "I've got you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I will always have you." The first year was survival by inches. Marion converted the bookstore's storage room into a makeshift nursery so Sandra could work while the Bobbies slept in shifts, which was rarely. Sandra learned to function on 3 hours of sleep, to nurse one baby while bouncing another, to recognize the difference between hungry cries and lonely ones. She learned that love could be simultaneously exhausting and the only thing keeping her alive. Money was always tight, sometimes terrifyingly so. Sandra clipped coupons, bought diapers in bulk when they went on sale, accepted hand-me-down clothes from the community center women without the pride that would have starved her children. She learned the particular shame of counting change at the grocery store checkout, the humiliation of using WIC vouchers while other customers sighed behind her in line. But she also learned that shame was just another luxury she could not afford. When the triplets turned 18 months, Sandra enrolled in online business courses, studying after midnight when the Bobbies finally slept, her laptop balanced on her knees in the dim glow of a nightlight. She had a vision forming, fragile but persistent. A children's boutique specializing in affordable, quality clothing for families like hers. Families where love was abundant but resources were not. Marion offered the bookstore's unused back corner. Sandra spent 6 months transforming it, painting walls during nap time, building display racks from reclaimed wood, curating inventory with the precision of someone who understood exactly what struggling mothers needed. She named it 3 Graces, and when it opened, the community showed up. Not out of pity, but because Sandra had become one of them, a woman who understood that asking for help and working relentlessly were not contradictions but survival. The boutique grew slowly, steadily. Sandra hired 2 part-time employees, both single mothers who needed flexible hours. She organized clothing swaps and parenting workshops. She created a space where women did not have to pretend their lives were easy, where children could play while mothers caught their breath. Carl Benson's name stopped echoing in her mind somewhere during this transformation. She did not wake up thinking about him anymore, did not imagine conversations where he begged for forgiveness or she delivered perfect speeches about his cruelty. He simply became part of her history, like childhood or college, something that happened to a previous version of herself. The scar remained, of course. Some nights, watching her children sleep, she wondered what kind of man could look at his own blood and call it a mistake. But the wondering held no heat now, no rage, just a distant sadness for the emptiness that must live inside someone capable of such coldness. By the time the triplets turned 4, Sandra had become someone she barely recognized from the woman who left the city 5 years ago. She wore her hair natural now, wild curls she had once straightened to fit into Carl's polished world. She laughed easily, her children's joy infectious and constant. She had friends who knew her as Sandra the boutique owner, Sandra who organized community events, Sandra whose kids were the adorable triplets who held hands walking to the park. Not Sandra who was abandoned, not Sandra who was called a mistake. Just Sandra whole enough. She stood in Three Graces one evening after closing, the setting sun painting everything amber through the front windows. Maya was showing Zara how to fold small shirts, their serious concentration making Sandra smile. Caleb sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing elaborate scenes of dragons and castles, narrating the story to himself in whispered intensity. This was her empire, not steel and glass towers, not boardrooms and billion-dollar mergers, but this, children who felt safe, a business built on compassion, a community that held her when she needed holding and celebrated when she stood tall. Carl Benson had billions, but he had never had this. He had never known what it felt like to be loved without conditions, needed without resentment, enough exactly as he was. Sandra finally understood. She had not lost anything when she walked away. She had saved herself. And in saving herself, she had built something infinitely more valuable than anything his money could have bought. A life where love was not a transaction, where worth was not measured in zeros on a check, where 3 small humans looked at her like she hung the moon. Because to them she had. Carl Benson had not thought about Sandra Nelson in months, or at least, that was the lie he told himself every time her name flickered through his consciousness like a ghost he refused to acknowledge. 5 years had a way of eroding guilt into something manageable, something that only surfaced at 3 a.m. or after the 3rd glass of scotch. He had convinced himself that paying for silence was the same as resolution, that her disappearance meant the problem had solved itself. The Coastal Business Expansion Summit was supposed to be routine, a weekend of networking, a keynote speech about sustainable growth, photographs with local officials. Carl's company was investing in the region's infrastructure, and his presence was both strategic and obligatory. He moved through the hotel ballroom with practiced ease, shaking hands, smiling at the right moments, his mind already calculating the return flight schedule. Then he saw her. At first, his brain refused to process the information correctly. The woman across the room could not be Sandra because Sandra was a memory, a closed chapter, a mistake efficiently handled 5 years ago. But the angle of her jaw, the way she tilted her head when listening, the particular grace in her movements, his body recognized her before his mind accepted the reality. She stood near the refreshment table, laughing at something someone said, wearing a navy dress that suggested confidence rather than seduction, her natural curls framing her face like a crown. She looked radiant, whole, Nothing like the trembling woman who had sat across from his desk, staring at a check she refused to take. Carl's chest constricted. His champagne glass felt impossibly heavy. Then he saw the children. 3 of them clustered around Sandra like satellites orbiting the sun. 2 boys in matching navy suits, 1 girl in a white dress with her hair in elaborate braids. They were perhaps 4 or 5 years old, the precise age that made Carl's blood run cold. The girl was showing her mother something in a small notebook, her excitement evident in animated gestures. One of the boys stood close to Sandra's side, his hand wrapped around her fingers, while the other examined the elaborate ice sculpture with scientific intensity. Time fractured. Carl's vision tunneled, the ballroom noise reducing to white static. He studied their faces with desperate attention, looking for proof that he was wrong, that this was coincidence, that these children belonged to some other story entirely. But biology was not subtle. The older boy had Carl's nose, the exact slope and proportion. The girl had his mother's eyes, that particular shade of blue that ran through the Benson family like a signature. The younger boy's facial structure. The set of his jaw, Carl saw his own childhood photographs superimposed over the living child standing 15 feet away. His children, 3 of them. The realization did not arrive gently. It detonated in his chest, destroying every carefully constructed justification he had built over 5 years. She had been pregnant with triplets. He had called them a mistake and offered money to make them disappear. And Sandra had chosen poverty, chosen single motherhood, chosen the terrifying uncertainty of raising 3 children alone rather than accept anything from him. Carl took an involuntary step forward, then froze as Sandra's gaze lifted and found his across the crowded room. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Carl waited for shock to register on her face, for fear or anger or the desperate hope he suddenly realized he wanted to see. Instead, Sandra's expression remained calm, almost neutral. She did not gasp or pale or reach protectively for her children. She simply acknowledged his existence with the same mild recognition she might give an old colleague whose name she barely remembered. Then she looked away. The dismissal was more devastating than any confrontation could have been. Carl watched as a woman approached Sandra, greeting her warmly, and Sandra introduced her children with obvious pride. Maya, Caleb, and Zara. He could hear their names even across the distance, could see how they interacted with practiced ease, a unit that functioned perfectly without him. Mr. Benson, his assistant touched his elbow. The mayor is ready for the photograph. Carl nodded automatically, his body moving through the motions while his mind remained fractured. He smiled for cameras, delivered remarks he did not remember composing, shook hands with people whose faces he would not recall. All the while, his peripheral vision tracked Sandra and the children as they moved through the event, entirely self-contained, requiring nothing from him. She left early, gathering her children with gentle efficiency. Maya held the door for her brothers, Zara skipped ahead, Caleb walked backward so he could keep talking to his mother. They disappeared into the parking lot, and Carl stood frozen near the ballroom windows, watching the taillights of a modest sedan fade into the evening. 5 years ago, he had erased her from his life with a check and cold words. Tonight, he discovered she had erased him far more completely, by building a life so full, so rich, so obviously complete that his absence had not left any space at all. For the first time in Carl Benson's carefully controlled life, he understood what it meant to be irrelevant. And it felt like drowning. Carl Benson did not sleep the night he saw Sandra and the children. He sat in his hotel suite overlooking the ocean, laptop open, searching for traces of the life she had built without him. Social media yielded nothing. Sandra had no digital footprint beyond a basic business page for 3 Graces. So he did what powerful men do when information does not come willingly. He paid for it. The private investigators' report arrived by Thursday morning. 23 pages detailing Sandra's last 5 years, addresses, employment history, financial records, even photographs of her daily routine. Carl told himself this was due diligence, necessary research before approaching her properly. He did not acknowledge that surveilling a woman who had every reason to fear him was itself a violation. The facts assembled themselves into a narrative that Carl found both devastating and somehow validating. Sandra Nelson, age 29, owner of 3 Graces Children's Boutique, annual income approximately $43,000, rents a 2-bedroom duplex at $1,400 monthly, no child support received, no romantic relationships documented, triplets enrolled at Seaside Elementary on scholarship assistance. He stared at the income figure until the numbers blurred. $43,000. He spent more than that on watch maintenance. The triplets, his children, were being raised on less than he paid his housekeeper. This was not guilt Carl felt. Guilt was passive, useless. This was urgency, responsibility, the moral imperative to fix what he had broken. That he might be the last person qualified to fix anything did not cross his mind. Friday afternoon, Carl arrived at 3 Graces with a plan. He had rehearsed the conversation, anticipated objections, prepared counterarguments. What he had not prepared for was Sandra's complete lack of surprise when she saw him standing in her boutique. "Mr. Benson," she did not look up from the inventory spreadsheet on her laptop. "I'm working. I won't take much of your time." Carl glanced around the small shop, noting the modest fixtures, the hand-painted price tags, the obvious care in every detail. "Sandra, we need to discuss the children." "No, we don't." She closed the laptop with deliberate calm. "You need to discuss them. I need you to leave." "They're mine too." The words emerged with more force than Carl intended. "Biologically, legally. You have no legal claim to children you've never met, never supported, and explicitly rejected before they were born." Sandra's voice remained steady, clinical. "I checked with a lawyer after I saw you at the summit. You have nothing." The revelation that she had consulted an attorney first, that she had anticipated this confrontation and armored herself against it, made something twist in Carl's chest. She was always 3 steps ahead, protecting what was hers. "I don't want a legal battle," he said, forcing his tone softer. "I want to help. I've set up trust funds, 3 accounts, $5 million each. They'll have access at 18, but I can release funds earlier for education, medical." "No." The single word landed like a door slamming. "Sandra, be reasonable. That money could." "Could do what exactly?" She stood now, moving around the counter to face him directly. "Pay for private school, music lessons, college. And what would you want in return, Carl? Visitation rights, photos and updates. A slow infiltration into their lives until they start asking why mommy's friend Mr. Benson is always around." "I'm not asking to infiltrate anything. I'm asking to provide for my children." "Your children," Sandra laughed, a sound without humor. "You know what's fascinating? You spent 5 years not thinking about them at all. Now that you've seen them, now that they're real to you, suddenly you're a father. Suddenly you have rights and responsibilities and feelings." "I made a mistake." "You made a choice." Sandra's composure cracked slightly, heat bleeding into her voice. You looked at a woman you claimed to care about and called her existence a mistake. You offered money to erase 3 human lives before they took their first breath. That was not an error in judgment, Carl. That was character. Carl felt the conversation slipping away from him, the carefully constructed apology dissolving under the weight of her accuracy. People change. I've had 5 years to regret. Regret is not a door key. It doesn't grant you access just because you finally feel bad about your choices. Sandra crossed her arms, her posture shifting into something immovable. You want absolution. You want me to accept your money so you can sleep better at night, tell yourself you're a good man who stepped up, but your comfort is not my responsibility. This isn't about comfort, it's about what's right. What's right would have been showing up 5 years ago. What's right would have been choosing us when it was hard, when it would have cost you something real. Sandra moved back toward her laptop, the gesture a clear dismissal. What you're offering now is convenient righteousness. You've already won everything, the merger, the company, the reputation. Now you want the children too, because why should Carl Benson have everything? The assessment hit uncomfortably close to something Carl had not examined. Did he want them because they were his children, or because they represented the only thing that had ever been denied him? Tell me what you need, he said, desperation creeping into his voice. If not money, then what? How do I make this right? Sandra looked at him for a long moment, and Carl saw something in her expression that terrified him more than anger ever could. Pity. You can't, she said simply. Some things, once broken, don't get fixed just because you finally decided you want them whole. You need to make peace with that, Carl, because I have. She turned back to her work, and Carl understood he had been dismissed with the same casual finality he had once used to erase her from his life. He stood there, a billionaire in a modest boutique, surrounded by evidence of a life that functioned perfectly without him, and felt something he had never experienced before: powerless. Carl Benson had always believed persistence was strength, that refusing to accept defeat was what separated winners from everyone else. Standing in Sandra's shop, watching her move through her work as though he had already ceased to exist, he began to understand that persistence without wisdom was just another word for harassment. But understanding and accepting were different things entirely. Carl did not leave the coastal town. He told his assistant to clear his schedule for the week, rented a house overlooking the marina, and convinced himself this was about being available when Sandra came to her senses. Because she would. Everyone eventually accepted his help. Money was the universal solvent. It dissolved problems, opened doors, transformed no into yes. He just needed to present the right offer. By Monday, Carl had assembled what he considered an irrefutable proposal. He arrived at 3 Graces during the lunch hour when he knew Sandra would be alone, carrying a leather portfolio that contained documents his lawyers had spent the weekend preparing. Sandra looked up from helping a customer, and her expression shifted from professional warmth to weary resignation. She finished the transaction, walked the woman to the door, then flipped the sign to closed 30 minutes early. "You're costing me business," she said. "I'll compensate you for the lost revenue." Carl set the portfolio on the counter. "I need 20 minutes. After that, if you still want me gone, I'll leave." Sandra studied him with the particular exhaustion of someone who knew arguing would take longer than listening. 20 minutes, then you leave and don't come back. Carl opened the portfolio with the confidence of someone about to solve an equation. "I've had my legal team draft a comprehensive support agreement. No custody implications. No visitation requirements unless you explicitly consent. Just financial provisions for everything the children need. He slid the first document across the counter. Full tuition coverage for any school you choose, private, public, boarding if that's your preference. All extracurricular activities funded. Music lessons, sports, academic enrichment, whatever they want to explore. Sandra glanced at the paper but did not touch it. Carl continued, warming to his presentation. Medical expenses, full coverage including dental, vision, any specialists. I've also allocated funds for a college trust that starts accruing interest now. By the time they're 18, each child will have approximately $8 million available. Still no reaction, he pressed forward. Housing. I can purchase a property outright. You'd have full ownership, no strings. 4 bedrooms minimum, good school district, whatever location you prefer. Or if you'd rather stay where you are, I can pay off your landlord and establish a perpetual fund for all housing costs. He produced another document. Business capital. 3 graces clearly means something to you, so I've structured an investment that would allow expansion. Additional locations, increased inventory, employees with benefits. You'd maintain complete creative and operational control. The silence stretched. Carl found himself speaking faster, as though velocity could compensate for Sandra's lack of response. There's also a personal allowance for you. Nothing extravagant, just enough that you're not constantly stressed about money. You could hire help, take vacations with the children, have breathing room. And before you object, this is not charity. This is the bare minimum of what I should have provided from the beginning. He laid out the final document, the one his lawyers said would seal the agreement. All of this requires nothing from you except a signature. No access to the children unless you decide otherwise. No public acknowledgement. I'll be a silent benefactor. You maintain complete autonomy. Carl looked up, expecting at least consideration, perhaps questions about specifics. Instead, Sandra was staring at him with something that looked disturbingly like pity. "Are you finished?" she asked quietly. "Sandra, this solves everything." "It solves nothing." She pushed the documents back across the counter without reading them, because the problem was never money. "Then what is the problem?" Frustration bled into Carl's voice. "I'm offering you everything. Security, opportunity, freedom from financial stress. What more could you possibly want? I want you to understand that everything you just offered comes with a price I'm not willing to pay." Sandra leaned against the counter, her posture suggesting this conversation was exhausting her on a cellular level. "That signature you want. It means you're in our lives forever. Every decision I make gets filtered through, what will Carl think? Every boundary I set gets negotiated against, but he's paying for everything." I said no strings. "There are always strings, Carl. That's how men like you operate." Sandra's voice remained calm, but steel ran through it. "Today it's just money, no access required. 6 months from now, you're asking to attend a school play because you funded the tuition. A year from now, you want to meet them because you paid for the house they live in. 5 years from now, you're threatening to withdraw support because I made a parenting choice you disagree with." "I would never." "You called my pregnancy a mistake and tried to erase it with a check. Forgive me for not trusting your promises." Sandra straightened, and Carl recognized the posture of someone who had made a decision and would not be moved. "Here. What you don't understand. I spent 5 years building a life where no one has power over me. Not landlords, not employers, not men who think their money makes them necessary. I am not rich, but I am free. That freedom, is worth more than anything in your portfolio." Carl felt something crumbling inside him, the foundation of his entire worldview developing cracks. "You're choosing poverty over. I'm choosing dignity over dependence." Sandra moved toward the door, their 20 minutes clearly expired. "My children eat well, sleep safely, and know they are loved without conditions. That is wealth. That is what matters." "They deserve more than just enough," Carl argued, following her. "They deserve a mother who cannot be bought." Sandra opened the door, evening air rushing in. "Every luxury you offer comes with a hidden cost. My autonomy, my authority, my ability to make decisions without your shadow looming over us. I'm not willing to trade my freedom for your guilt money." Carl stood in the doorway, the leather portfolio hanging useless in his hand. For the first time in his adult life, his primary tool had failed completely. Money had always worked. Money fixed problems, opened opportunities, made people grateful. But Sandra was looking at millions of dollars the way someone might regard a beautifully wrapped box containing poison. "You're being unreasonable," he said, the words emerging desperate rather than authoritative. "No, Carl, I'm being free." Sandra's expression softened slightly, but her resolve did not waver. "You want to help? Then help by leaving us alone. That's the only thing you can give me that I actually need." The door closed with the same quiet finality as before. Carl walked back to his rental car, portfolio in hand, documents unread and unsigned. He sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes, staring at the modest boutique where Sandra was probably already back at work, unshaken by everything he had offered. Carl Benson had built an empire on the premise that everything had a price, that enough money could solve any problem. Sandra Nelson had just proven that some things, dignity, autonomy, freedom, could not be purchased at any cost. And for a man whose entire identity was built on being the solution, discovering he was irrelevant felt like standing on ground that had suddenly ceased to be solid. He was not needed. He was not even wanted. He was simply accountable for an absence that no amount of money could retroactively fill. Carl spent 3 days convincing himself that Sandra was being irrational. She was letting pride endanger the children's future, choosing struggle over security out of spite. By Thursday, his patience, that thin veneer of contrition he had been performing, began to crack. He appeared at 3 Grace's late afternoon, after the elementary school day ended, when he knew Sandra would be managing the after-school rush of mothers and children. He watched through the window as Maya, Caleb, and Zara sat at a small table in the corner, doing homework while their mother worked. The domesticity of it, the ease with which Sandra moved between her roles, should have been beautiful. Instead, it filled Carl with something darker, resentment that she had built this without him, and determination that she would not keep it from him any longer. Sandra saw him enter and her entire body tensed. She finished with her customer quickly, then approached him with her phone already in hand, recording app visible on the screen. "I'm documenting this conversation," she said clearly. "State your business or leave." The phone startled him, the implication that she needed evidence. "That's not necessary. I just want to talk reasonably. The last 3 visits haven't convinced you to leave us alone. I'm protecting myself." Sandra kept the phone positioned between them. "What do you want, Carl?" His prepared speech evaporated under the clinical nature of her defense. "I've been patient. I've been respectful. But you're not giving me any choice here, Sandra." "Choice?" Her eyebrow lifted. "You had a choice 5 years ago. I'm simply living with the consequences of the one you made." "Those are my children." Carl's voice dropped lower, the boardroom tone emerging despite his efforts to control it. I have rights. Legal rights. I've consulted with attorneys and they've made it very clear that paternity establishes certain claims. There it is. Sandra's expression shifted from wariness to something colder, harder. The threat underneath all those apologies. How long did it take you to get here, Carl? A week. That might be a record for men like you, pretending to respect boundaries before threatening legal action. I'm not threatening, I'm stating facts. But even as he said it, Carl heard how it sounded, saw how Sandra's grip on her phone tightened. Sandra, I'm trying to avoid lawyers, but if you force me. If I force you. Her voice rose slightly, and both of them glanced toward the children who were watching with confused concern. Sandra lowered her tone, but not its intensity. You're the one who showed up repeatedly after being asked to leave. You're the one surveilling my life, investigating my finances, appearing at my workplace. And now you're threatening legal action because I won't accept your money. Tell me how I'm forcing anything. Carl felt control slipping, felt the familiar frustration of not getting what he wanted rising like bile. I'm their father. I have influence in this state, connections to judges, family court attorneys who owe me favors. Do you understand what I could do if I chose to pursue custody? The words emerged before his better judgment could stop them, and the moment they landed, Carl saw Sandra's face transform. Not with fear exactly, but with a vindication that was somehow worse. There he is, she said quietly. The real Carl Benson, the man who erases inconvenient people with checks and threats. Thank you for reminding me why I left. Sandra, I didn't mean. Yes, you did. She stepped closer, phone still recording, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. You meant every word. When money didn't work, when charm didn't work, you went directly to intimidation. You're threatening to use your wealth and influence to take my children away because I won't let you back into our lives on your terms. Carl's face flushed. I'm not trying to take them away. I'm trying to be part of their lives. By threatening their mother with legal action, Sandra's laugh was sharp, bitter. That's not love, Carl. That's ownership. That's you treating human beings like assets you're entitled to acquire. You're twisting my words. I'm repeating your words. Sandra held up the phone, which are all documented now, along with your admission that you have connections to judges and attorneys who owe you favors. You just handed me everything I need to get a restraining order. The realization hit Carl like cold water. He had done exactly what his lawyers warned him not to do, allowed emotion to override strategy, allowed his need for control to reveal itself. I'm not going to hurt you or the children. I would never. You already did. Sandra's voice broke slightly. 5 years ago, you hurt me more than you're apparently capable of understanding. And now you're proving that you haven't changed at all. You still think people are problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed, things you can control with money or threats. That's not fair. Fair? Sandra's composure shattered briefly. You want to talk about fair? I raised triplets alone while you built your empire. I survived on food pantry donations while you bought vacation homes. I made sure our children felt safe and loved every single day while you didn't think about them at all. And now you stand in my store, threatening to use your money and power to take them away because your feelings are hurt. Tell me where fair enters this equation, Carl. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Every response that occurred to him sounded like an excuse, a justification, another attempt to avoid accountability. Sandra watched him struggle and something like sadness crossed her face. You know what the tragedy is. If you had just stayed away, I might have eventually considered letting you meet them. In a few years, when they were older, when I felt more secure. But this confirms every fear that made me leave in the first place. I'm not the villain you're making me out to be." The words sounded hollow even to Carl's ears. "No, you're worse, because you genuinely believe you're the good guy in this story." Sandra moved toward the door, their conversation clearly ending. "You're a man so accustomed to getting what he wants that you can't distinguish between love and acquisition. You don't want to be their father, Carl. You want to own them, just like you try to own everything else." Carl stood frozen, seeing himself reflected in Sandra's eyes, not as the remorseful man seeking redemption he imagined himself to be, but as the threat he actually was. A man with unlimited resources and limited empathy, someone who viewed his children as possessions denied him rather than people with their own needs and protection. "I'll be filing a restraining order tomorrow," Sandra continued, her legal precision returning. "You are not to come within 500 feet of me, my children, my home, or my business. Any further contact will be considered harassment. Do you understand?" "Sandra, please. Do you understand?" Her voice cracked like a whip. Yes, the word tasted like ash. Carl walked out of Three Graces knowing he had just burned the only bridge that might have eventually led him back to his children. He sat in his car, hands shaking on the steering wheel, and for the first time allowed himself to see the truth Sandra had been showing him all along. He was not a father trying to reconnect with his children. He was a powerful man angry that someone had dared to say no, using the language of love to disguise the reality of control. Sandra had been right to refuse his money, right to refuse his presence, right to protect her children from a man who could threaten their mother in one breath and call it love in the next. Carl Benson had thought he wanted redemption. But what he actually wanted was compliance. And the difference between those two things was everything. Carl Benson sat in his rental house overlooking the marina, watching fishing boats return with the evening tide, and understood that he was looking at his last sunset in this town. The restraining order paperwork sat on the coffee table, unsigned by a judge but promised. His lawyers had called twice, offering strategies to contest it, leverage to apply, connections to exploit. He had told them to stand down. The realization had come slowly, painfully, like waking from surgery to discover what had been removed. He was not the hero of this story. He was barely even a character, just a cautionary tale, a mistake Sandra had survived, a wound that had scarred over and healed in his absence. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to fight. Carl Benson did not retreat. He did not accept defeat. He solved problems, overcame obstacles, won. Winning was his identity, the core of everything he had built. But what if winning meant destroying the very people he claimed to love? The question sat in his chest like a stone. He thought about the children, Maya with her fierce concentration, Caleb with his quiet observation, Zara with her explosive joy. They were happy. Genuinely, completely happy in the life Sandra had built. They did not have his wealth, but they had something he had never possessed. Security in being loved without conditions, without performance, without the constant calculation of worth. What right did he have to disrupt that? What right did his belated remorse give him to insert himself into lives that functioned beautifully without him? The answer, Carl finally admitted, was none. He pulled out hotel stationery, the expensive kind with watermarked letterhead, then set it aside. This did not require corporate presentation. He found a simple notebook, the kind Sandra probably used for inventory at Three Graces, and began to write. Sandra asterisk. I'm leaving tomorrow, not because you forced me to, but because staying would only prove everything you believe about me is true. I came here thinking I could fix what I broke. I see now that some things once shattered cannot be reassembled by the person who destroyed them. You spent 5 years healing wounds I inflicted. I have no right to reopen them by demanding access to forgiveness I have not earned. You were right about everything. The money was about control. The persistence was about ego. Even my remorse was contaminated by entitlement, the belief that feeling bad about my choices entitled me to undo their consequences. I threatened you. I used my power as a weapon, just as I did 5 years ago. I proved that the man who called you a mistake is still the man I am when I do not get what I want. That man has no place in your life, and certainly no place in those children's lives. I am not writing this to ask for forgiveness or to negotiate some future contact. I am writing because you deserve to know that you were right to refuse everything I offered. You were right to protect yourself and them from me. Your strength in walking away saved all of you from a man who did not deserve you. Maya, Caleb, and Zara are extraordinary because you raised them. They are happy because you chose their well-being over your own comfort. They are whole because you loved them enough to leave a man who could not see their worth. I will not contact you again. I will not hire investigators or send lawyers or show up uninvited. This is not a promise designed to earn your trust. It is simply the bare minimum of respect you should have received from the beginning. If someday, years from now, you decide those children deserve to know where half their DNA originated, I will answer whatever questions you deem appropriate. Until then, I am removing myself completely from your lives. I cannot give you back the 5 years I stole through my cruelty. I cannot undo the fear, the loneliness, the struggle you endured because I called your pregnancy a mistake. But I can give you this. My absence, freely chosen, without conditions or expectations. You built something beautiful in the wreckage I left behind. I will not destroy it by trying to claim credit for survival I nearly prevented. Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like. Thank you for protecting those children from me when I could not be trusted to protect them myself. I am sorry. Not because I want something from you, but because you deserved better than what I gave you. Carl. He read it 3 times, checking for the manipulation that came so naturally to him, the subtle pressure disguised as humility. Satisfied it contained no hooks, no hidden negotiations, he placed it in an envelope and wrote Sandra's name on the front. That evening, after Three Graces had closed, Carl placed the envelope in the mail slot. He did not wait to see if she retrieved it. He did not linger for one last glimpse of the children. He simply returned to his rental, packed his belongings, and scheduled a morning flight. His assistant called with questions about the coastal expansion project, the business reason that had brought him here. Carl approved the local manager's recommendations sight unseen. The project would continue without his direct involvement. Some things functioned better in his absence. The next morning, Carl drove to the airport through streets he would never see again. He passed Seaside Elementary, where his children attended school, Three Graces, where Sandra had built her empire from nothing, the duplex where his family lived without him. At the security checkpoint, he turned off his phone completely, not just silenced, but powered down. For the first time in his professional life, Carl Benson made himself unreachable. On the plane, staring at clouds that looked like scattered cotton, He understood that walking away was not defeat. It was the first genuinely loving thing he had done for Sandra and those children. His absence was the only gift they actually needed. Redemption, he realized, was not about being forgiven. It was about stopping the harm. It was about recognizing when your presence caused more damage than your absence. Carl Benson had spent his entire life acquiring things. Today, he chose to let go of the only things that actually mattered. Not because he stopped wanting them, but because wanting them was not enough. Because love without the right to love was just another form of violence. The plane lifted into winter sky, carrying him away from the family he would never know. And for the first time in 5 years, Carl allowed himself to cry. Not for what he had lost, but for what he had destroyed before it ever had a chance to exist. Sandra found the letter 3 days after Carl left. She had been avoiding the mail slot, half expecting legal documents or another attempt at negotiation. Instead, she found a simple envelope with her name written in handwriting that looked less confident than she expected from a billionaire CEO. She did not read it immediately. The envelope sat on her kitchen counter for 2 days, a small white rectangle she circled around while making breakfast, helping with homework, living the life she had built. Finally, on a quiet Sunday evening after the triplets were asleep, Sandra opened it. She read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the lockbox where she kept birth certificates and insurance papers, not as something precious, but as evidence. Proof that Carl Benson had finally, belatedly, understood what she had been trying to tell him all along. 3 months passed, then 6, then a year. Carl did not call, did not appear, did not send investigators or lawyers or surprise gifts. His absence was so complete that Sandra occasionally found herself checking his company's news releases, confirming he still existed somewhere in the world. He did, but that world and hers no longer intersected. The triplets started first grade. Maya discovered a passion for mathematics that had her solving problems 2 grades above her level. Caleb developed an obsession with marine biology, his room slowly filling with library books about ocean ecosystems. Zara declared she would be a dancer and practiced pirouettes in the living room until the downstairs neighbors complained. Sandra expanded 3 Graces into the adjacent storefront, hired 3 more employees, started a nonprofit providing school clothes to low-income families. She dated briefly, a kind teacher, a thoughtful contractor, but her heart was not ready to trust romantic love again. Perhaps it never would be. The realization did not sadden her as much as it once might have. She was whole without partnership. Her children were proof that family did not require the traditional structure, that love multiplied rather than divided when shared with open hands. 18 months after Carl's departure, Sandra received an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read only, "No response required." Sandra *. I know I promised not to contact you. If this violates that promise, I apologize and will not repeat it. I wanted you to know that I have established education trusts for Maya, Caleb, and Zara. You will receive no communication about this, no statements or updates. The funds are managed by a third-party firm that has no connection to me personally. When each child turns 18, they will be notified of the account's existence and can choose whether to access them. This is not an attempt to insert myself into their lives. It is simply an acknowledgement that they exist, that they deserve opportunities, and that providing those opportunities is the least I can do from a distance. You retain complete authority over their upbringing, their education, their futures. This changes nothing about your autonomy. I am not asking for gratitude or contact. I am simply doing what I should have done 5 years ago, taking responsibility without demanding recognition. I hope you and the children are well. Carl. Sandra stared at the email for a long time. She forwarded it to her lawyer, who confirmed the trusts existed, were legally sound, and indeed gave Sandra no obligation to Carl. The money would sit untouched until the children were adults, at which point they could make their own choices about their father's belated gesture. She did not respond to the email, but she did not delete it either. 2 years after Carl walked away, Sandra received a second email. Sandra asterisk. I have been in therapy for 18 months, not to fix myself so I can ask for access to the children. That is not my right to request, but because I needed to understand how I became someone capable of what I did to you. My therapist suggested I write letters I will never send. I have written hundreds to you and the children. They sit in a folder on my computer, unsent and unsendable, but the act of writing them has taught me things about love I should have learned decades ago. I am writing today only because Maya turns 7 tomorrow. I remember nothing about being 7, except that my father gave me a watch I was terrified to wear in case I broke it. I hope her birthday is filled with gifts that invite joy rather than fear. I will not contact you on Caleb's birthday, or Zara's, or any future date. This is not the beginning of a pattern. This is me marking privately a day that matters, and acknowledging to the only person who would understand why it matters that I am thinking of her, of them, from a distance that I will maintain. I hope they are happy. I hope you are happy. That is all I have the right to hope for. Carl. Sandra closed her laptop and walked to the living room where the triplets were building an elaborate blanket fort, their laughter rising like music. Maya directed the construction with 7-year-old authority. Caleb reinforced weak points with engineering precision. Zara decorated the entrance with drawings of stars and dolphins. They did not know their father's name. They did not know he existed at all. Sandra had told them only that she loved them enough for 2 parents, and so far that truth had been sufficient. Someday they would ask more complicated questions. Someday Sandra would have to decide how much truth children deserved about adults who failed them. But today was not that day. Today was about blanket forts and birthday cake and children who knew they were wanted, loved, and enough exactly as they were. Sandra never responded to Carl's emails, but she did not block his address either. His messages arrived once or twice a year, never demanding, never negotiating, just quiet acknowledgments of milestones he had no right to witness, but apparently could not stop marking privately. 5 years after he walked away, Sandra received a final message. Sandra asterisk. The children are 10 now, old enough to form opinions, ask questions, perhaps even search for information if they're curious. If they ever ask about me, tell them whatever truth you believe serves them best. If that truth is, he was not ready to be a father, you would not be lying. If it is, he made choices he regretted but could not undo, that would also be accurate. I will not contact you again unless you initiate it. I am removing myself not as punishment, but as respect for the boundary you set, and I violated repeatedly before finally understanding its necessity. Thank you for being the parent I could not be. Thank you for choosing them over comfort, over security, over a man who did not deserve the choice. They are extraordinary because you made them so. Carl. Sandra read the email at her kitchen table. coffee growing cold in her hands, and felt something she had not expected. Not forgiveness exactly, but the absence of active anger. Carl Benson had taken something from her that could never be returned. Her trust, her innocence, years she could have spent loved rather than abandoned. But he had also, accidentally, given her something irreplaceable. Proof of her own strength, 3 children who would never doubt they were wanted, and the freedom of a life built entirely on her own terms. She closed the laptop and did not respond. But she did not delete his address either. Redemption was not a destination you arrived at. It was a daily choice, repeated quietly, with no guarantee of forgiveness or reconciliation. Carl Benson was choosing his version of it from a distance, respecting boundaries he once violated, providing support without demanding recognition. Whether that was enough was not for Sandra to decide. It was for Maya, Caleb, and Zara, years from now, when they were old enough to understand that adults were complicated, that mistakes had weight, and that love came in forms more subtle than fairy tales suggested. Until then, Sandra would continue being what Carl had never learned to be: present, consistent, and enough. Not because it earned her anything, but because that was what love actually looked like. 10 years after Carl Benson called her a mistake, Sandra Nelson stood in her expanded boutique during the holiday rush, watching her now teenage children help customers with the easy competence of people raised to be kind. Maya ran the register with mathematical precision. Caleb organized inventory with systems thinking. Zara charmed toddlers into trying on coats with theatrical flair. They were whole, happy, and entirely unaware that somewhere in a city 3 hours away, a man they had never met marked their existence in emails he sent to their mother, but never expected her to answer. Sandra's phone buzzed. An email notification. She did not need to check to know it was probably Carl, acknowledging some milestone only a parent would notice. She left it unread. Not out of cruelty, but because some relationships existed best in absence. Because love sometimes meant staying away. Because the greatest gift Carl Benson had ever given his children was the space to grow without his shadow. Sandra locked up 3 Graces that evening, her children laughing in the parking lot, and understood what Carl was only beginning to learn: that real love required nothing in return. Not gratitude, not access, not even acknowledgement. Just the quiet certainty that somewhere, people you cared about were thriving because you had finally learned when to let go.